In the 12th month of the third year of drought, a royal grain administrator named Eshuwara sat inside a stone storehouse on the coast of what is now western Turkey, and he wrote a letter. It was approximately 1190 BCE. Eshuwara governed the port city of Ugarit on behalf of the Hittite king. He had received, just days earlier, a desperate message from the king of Alatia, the island we now call Cyprus, describing ships, enemy ships, dozens of them, appearing without warning from the open sea. Villages burned, grain stores taken, his own cities set to ash. Eshuwara wrote back. He was honest. He had no ships to send. He had no grain to spare. Every soldier he had was already marching somewhere else, chasing a famine that moved faster than armies. He sealed the clay tablet. It was never sent. The tablet was found in 1986 in the ruins of Ugarit, still in its envelope. The city above it had been destroyed so completely and so suddenly that no one had come back to collect the mail. That is where this story begins. Not in a palace and not in a battle. In a granary that ran out of grain, in a city that ran out of time, at the end of a world that had taken 1,000 years to build. By the time Eshuwara wrote that letter, the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age had already begun to die. It would be completely gone within 50 years. What the ancient Egyptians called the Nine Bows, the web of trading kingdoms that stretched from Greece to Mesopotamia, had, by 1200 BCE, moved more grain, copper, tin, and olive oil than any civilization would manage again for nearly 2 millennia. The Hittite Empire controlled central Anatolia from Hattusa. Mycenaean and Palace states dotted the Greek mainland. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes. Egypt, under Ramesses III, held the Nile Delta and the Levantine coast. Ugarit, Alatia, the cities of Canaan, all of them nodes in an interconnected system of agricultural surplus and long-distance trade. In 1207 BCE, Ramesses III carved this boast into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. No land could stand before their arms. He was right to be afraid. Within 2 generations, nearly every palace, every administrative center, every grain archive in that entire civilization would be rubble. The question scholars argued over for a century was, why? For most of the 20th century, historians blamed what they called the Sea Peoples, a confederation of unnamed raiders from somewhere north or west, who swept through the eastern Mediterranean like a tide and drowned everything they touched. The Egyptian reliefs showed them clearly, warriors with feathered helmets, attacking in massed formations, coming from the sea. Ugarit burned. Mycenae fell. The Hittite capital Hattusa was abandoned so completely that even the Hittites left no account of why they left. The Sea Peoples theory was satisfying. It was simple. Invaders came. Civilization ended. But it was wrong. Or rather, it was incomplete in a way that mattered enormously. Because what scholars began to reconstruct in the 1990s and 2000s, through the careful work of archaeobotanists, climate scientists, and a generation of archive translators working through thousands of administrative clay tablets, was something far more disturbing. The civilizations of the Bronze Age did not die because invaders came from outside. They died because the food ran out. The evidence arrived slowly, from unexpected directions. In 2013, a team led by Brandon Drake published paleoclimate data from lake sediment cores taken in western Turkey and the Levant. What the cores showed was a sharp, sustained shift in rainfall patterns beginning around 1250 BCE and worsening through 1190 BCE, precisely the decades preceding the collapse. The eastern Mediterranean became significantly drier. Growing seasons shortened. Rainfall dropped by an estimated 30 to 50% across a region whose agriculture had been calibrated for centuries of relative abundance. At the same time, researchers working through the Linear B tablets from the Mycenaean Palace at Pylos, the last administrative records left before the city was burned, around 1180 BCE, found something striking. In the final years before destruction, the palace scribes had been obsessively cataloging grain. Every allocation, every redistribution, every emergency ration. The tablets documented a palace system trying to manage a food crisis through ever tighter administrative control. More grain was being tracked. Less grain was being produced. In the ruins of a grain storehouse at the Hittite capital Hattusa, archaeologists found a cache of cuneiform tablets from roughly 1215 BCE. They were requests, urgent ones, from the Hittite king Tudaliya IV to the Egyptian pharaoh, begging for grain shipments. "It is a matter of life and death," one tablet read. The king of an empire that had held central Anatolia for 4 centuries was asking for food. The grain ships came, for a while, and then the trade network that could send them began to falter. This is the agricultural mechanism that modern scholarship has come to call the fragility of complexity. The Bronze Age palace economies were not robust systems. They were optimized systems. Every piece of surplus grain produced in one region fed a specialist population somewhere else. Scribes in one city, bronze casters in another, sailors in a third. Grain moved constantly across the Mediterranean, so constantly that any disruption anywhere in the network created shortfalls everywhere. When climate stress reduced harvests across the region simultaneously, there was no slack. Palace administrators tried to compensate by increasing extraction from local peasant farmers, demanding higher grain quotas, reducing rations for non-essential personnel, pulling soldiers from border garrisons to work emergency harvests. This last decision proved catastrophic. Border garrisons thinned, roads went unpatrolled. Piracy, which had been suppressed by Hittite and Egyptian naval power for generations, returned. Groups of displaced people, some of whom were almost certainly the sea peoples of the Egyptian reliefs, moved through the destabilized countryside, some raiding, some simply migrating in search of food. They did not cause the collapse. They moved into the space that the collapse had already opened. At Pylos, on the southwestern tip of Greece, the final Linear B tablets show palace administrators responding to a maritime threat even as they struggled to feed the population. They were sending rowers to the coast, emergency conscription, and redistributing bronze from religious vessels to make weapons. They were doing everything right, by the logic of the system they had inherited. The city burned anyway, approximately 180 BCE. No one came back to rebuild it. At Ugarit, the destruction layer, a thick band of ash and collapsed mud brick, sits directly atop the administrative archive where Eshuwara's unsent letter was found. Archaeologists have found grain stored in sealed jars beneath the rubble. It was not an empty city when it died. It was a city with food that simply ran out of the stability required to use it. At Hattusa, there was no destruction layer at all. The city was abandoned, methodically, deliberately, over years. The Hittites took what they could carry and walked away from one of the largest administrative capitals of the ancient world. Into what? History does not say. They dissolved so completely that the very existence of the Hittite Empire was forgotten until the decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century. In Egypt, only Ramesses III held. He recorded his victories against the sea peoples at Medinet Habu. 2 great battles, one on land, one on water, both repelled. He was right to be proud. Egypt survived, but even Egypt did not escape unchanged. The papyrus Wilbur, a land survey from approximately 1143 BCE, shows a landscape in which royal estates and temple estates had absorbed enormous quantities of formerly productive farmland. Private farmers had lost ground, literally. The administrative apparatus of the new kingdom, strained by decades of crisis management, was contracting inward. The reign of Ramesses III ended with a conspiracy in his own household. He was assassinated, or nearly so. The precise manner of his death remained disputed until a CT scan of his mummy in 2012 revealed a cut throat. The first recorded labor strike in history had occurred just years earlier, in 1170 BCE, when the workers who built the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina stopped work and sat down in protest. They had not been paid their grain rations in 2 months. The Egyptian New Kingdom would survive for another century, then collapse from within. The Bronze Age world it had belonged to was already gone. What ended in the eastern Mediterranean between 1200 and 1150 BCE was not simply a collection of cities and palaces. It was a system, an agricultural and commercial system of extraordinary sophistication, one that had taken more than 1,000 years to build and that, once broken, would not be rebuilt for centuries. The Greeks who emerged from the collapse, the Greeks of Homer, of the Polis, of the classical period, had no memory of Mycenae as anything but myth. They called the era before them the Age of Heroes, which is what people call a past too distant to understand and too magnificent to dismiss. The Hittites vanished so completely that they became a biblical footnote. The cities of Canaan rebuilt slowly, haltingly, as Phoenician city-states stripped of the palace economies that had once organized them. The world that came after was smaller, simpler, and more local, because local was all that was left when the network failed. The scholars who study this collapse now argue over the precise weighting. How much was climate? How much was the sea peoples? How much was internal social fracture? How much was simple bad luck, landing on a system with no resilience built in? Brandon Drake's climate data is solid. The linear B tablets are unambiguous. The grain requests from Hattusa are heartbreaking in their specificity. But underneath all of it is a simpler truth. The Bronze Age ended because the harvests failed, because a civilization that had organized itself around agricultural surplus, that had built its palaces and its armies and its long-distance trade and its administrative scribal class, all on the foundation of reliable grain, discovered that the foundation was not as reliable as they had built on top of it. They had optimized for abundance. They had not prepared for drought. And when the rains did not come, not for 1 year, not for 2, but for a generation, the complexity they had built collapsed from the bottom up, in a cascade that no palace administrator, no king, no battle-hardened pharaoh could arrest. Eshuwara knew something was wrong. He sat in his storehouse in Ugarit and wrote a letter to say so. No one came. We don't tell history from palaces or parliaments. We tell it from the fields, from the people who planted, prayed, and sometimes starved, so that civilizations could rise. The Bronze Age collapse is not a story about invaders. It is a story about what happens when a civilization forgets that everything it has built rests, in the end, on whether the grain comes in. The scribes of Pylos counted every bushel in their final days. The king of the Hittites begged for food with the language of life and death. A man in Ugarit wrote a letter that was never sent, sealed it, and never came back for it. The harvest failed. The world ended. These are the stories that changed everything, yet never made it into the history books you were handed in school. Stories that changed everything, yet never made it into the history books you were handed in school. If you'd like to be there when we tell them, a simple click on the subscribe button is all it takes. No pressure, just an open invitation to keep exploring the harvests that shaped our world.